the Rings, The Rings of Power, Season 2, Finale, Episode Breakdown and Reaction. As the finale opens, Prince Durin goes down into the mines to see that the ring has completely taken over his father, who has killed several dwarven miners in pursuit of wealth. The prince sends Disa to bring the wounded dwarves to the healer, and then goes down to face his father. The prince commands his father to take off the ring, vowing that he will use force if necessary. Durin III responds, "You're strong enough to use an axe, but are you strong enough to use it against your father?" The prince responds, "No, father, I'm not. You've always been stronger than me. Do you remember when I was a wee lad and we'd arm wrestle? You'd let me lift my hand just enough to think maybe I could win." And then he says, "And I knew there was nothing stronger than my father. Be strong again, father. Take it off, I beg you." But then the king responds, "A dwarf should never beg." King Durin continues to break rock until he breaks through, revealing rivers of mithril within the stone. "Come and see, my son. Come and see the true wealth of our mountain. Behold the dynasty of Durin." And then his father says, "But to see our mountain the way I do, you have to wear a ring, my son." And the prince responds, "It's not our mountain, father. You taught me that." The king says, "With these rings it could be." The Balrog's growl is heard, and its light shines on the king's face. The Balrog's whip then rises into the frame and grips King Durin's foot, pulling him down and revealing the Balrog in its full might. Durin IV is pushed back, and his father crawls towards him. In a breathtaking moment, Durin III takes off his ring and sets it aside on the stone. He takes up his axe and turns to face the Balrog. He says, "I never let you lift your hand. It was you, just you, getting stronger. Forgive me, my son, King Durin." The king is then buried along with the Balrog beneath falling rock. This moment immediately made me think of King Durin's line from Season 1, where he says to his son, "We do not dig in earth that cannot support it, delving into depths beyond the darkness, tempting shadow, rock, and mine to bury us all beneath the mountain." Wrapping up the Dwarven plotline, at the end of the finale, we also learn that there is contention among the other dwarf lords for the succession to the throne, which sets us up for some interesting drama in Season 3. There's not a lot of the dwarves in this episode, but the first sequence, the opening sequence, I've seen this episode like 6 times by now, and I just cry like a baby every single time. The relationship between father and son, as it's been explored, the conclusion to that relationship is just so moving. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later on as we kind of wrap up this episode. Moving on to Rune, the Istari in Rune. So the stranger comes to the Stour village, which appears to be abandoned, or maybe they're hiding. There he is met by the dark wizard, who is like really, really chummy with him, and it's actually really obnoxious. He's obviously like being a faker. He greets him as a long-lost friend. He says, "Manwe promised you would come. I confess my patience wavered, but my faith in you did not. Do I know you? We are as kin. But you were the one who convinced me to leave the uttermost west for this world, because you knew none of us could ever hope to defeat Sauron alone." I hate this guy. Not the actor. The actor's awesome. I don't like the character. Sorry. So this moment in the story is kind of reminiscent of a temptation of Christ. I can't help but notice that they've kind of seemed to have set up a lot of parallels in a similar way. The dark wizard then confesses that he seeks to destroy Sauron, but only because he wants to supplant him. The dark wizard bids the stranger to follow him to get answers about his past, his name, and his staff. Why do we care about his staff? I don't know. He portrays himself as a good wizard. He's a benevolent wizard. He doesn't embrace the name Dark Wizard, so eventually, maybe after 2 more seasons, we'll find out what his name is. We do learn a little bit about that guy named Brank. He's the one I've been referring to as Mad Max for most of the season. Apparently, his name is Brank. He tells the Dark Wizard that his people were kings once, before they were cursed by the wizard, And gosh, it's pretty disappointing. So Brank threatens the Harfoots. He is then harmed by the Dark Wizard. It's unclear whether he's killed, although I'm pretty sure there was some brain matter in the blood that we see on screen after he gets swooshed across into the rocks. So I'm not sure. It does appear that he might be dead, which is disappointing because here we have yet another cool character that is, for some reason, not explored whatsoever. But he says, "My people were once kings, wizard." And, that's super interesting. It's kind of a shame that I don't think we'll get to explore that any further. Ultimately, the stranger refuses to ally with the Dark Wizard. I'm super surprised. And he responds by creating a large magical situation in which rocks begin to fly around and then they fall all around the Stour village. The stranger is frozen in time somehow, but then is immediately able to break out of it in order to somewhat stop the rocks from falling. So Nori and Poppy escape while the stranger is stuck there, and then the rocks fall all around, and you can see very clearly the stranger's special stars. One thing I did enjoy from this sequence, or this scene, is when the Harfoots are mad that the Dark Wizard killed Brank, and he's like, "You'd pity someone who is about to kill you?" And then they're like, "Yes, of course." And then he goes, "Pity will not defeat Sauron." And obviously, I thought that was a cute line because we know it does. So let's talk about Grand Elf. The following morning, I'm assuming the Stours are preparing to begin their first migration, led by Nori and Poppy. As the Stours bid farewell to the stranger, a couple of them say, "Thank you kindly, Grand Elf." Nori also shares a tearful goodbye with the stranger. Poppy tells him not to be a stranger. And then Nori decides that she and the stranger need to kind of go on different paths. So the stranger and Nori are now going to part ways. Who knows if they will see each other again? I'm not sure. On the way out of the Stour village, the stranger picks up a staff-shaped branch that bears a striking resemblance to Gandalf's staff in the Peter Jackson films. And then he returns to the home of Tom Bombadil, who has the coolest porcupine teapot to make some tea for Gandalf, who he apparently knew was coming. So he comes back to his house, and we finally get the name reveal. He says, "Gandalf, that's what they're going to call me, isn't it?" Tom Bombadil is just kind of like, mm-hmm. And then they start singing. And the scene was funny because I was watching it with a couple of people, and all of us were pretty, I don't know, maybe I'd say exasperated by this. We didn't need to wait 16 episodes to learn that this guy was Gandalf, and calling him Grand Elf, it hurts me. But then immediately as soon as they start singing the Tom Bombadil song, we're all like, oh, okay. It was almost like I can feel the anger bubbling up in my heart, and then the Tom Bombadil song is immediately soothes all of that rage, and I'm just like, and so I just immediately felt better. So I thought that was great. I am relieved. I actually love the Tom Bombadil song. Once again, Bear McCreary is just a genius. So we survived the Gandalf reveal. Finally, at least it's over. And then before we wrap up our discussion of Rune, I do want to highlight this one section where Poppy gives this really beautiful and very sad speech. I thought it was really sweet, though. She says, "Some things lost are lost forever. No matter how hard we fight, how much it hurts, how much our hearts yearn to put them back together. Because this world is so much bigger than any of us. And sometimes the winds blowing against us are just too strong. At those times," Mr. Burroughs said, "we've just got to accept it. What's broke is broke and won't fix, and all anybody can do is try and build something new." And I thought this was a really beautiful, short little speech because a lot of the times when you're going through something very difficult, the kind of knee-jerk reaction is to try and fix something, to say, kind of as we have at the end of the episode, the sun yet shines, the sun's going to come out, everything's going to be great. But like allowing someone who's grieving to sit with that grief and to recognize, as Poppy does because she's lost her whole family, that sometimes you can never go back to the way things were before. You lose things and sometimes they are lost forever. And we see that with Eregion. They're never going to rebuild it. When Eregion falls, it's gone forever. Just like Celebrimbor is gone forever. And so having this line and this kind of room to grieve within the episode, I felt like that was really special. So now let's move over to Numenor. Once again, there's not a lot that happens in Numenor in this episode, but still some interesting stuff is going on. So in the king's court, Eregion has gathered the leaders of the faithful before Pharazôn. There they are rounded up because all of the faithful have now been declared traitors of Westerness. Because of his vision in the Pelargir, Pharazôn is now aware that Halbrand is Sauron, and he believes that Miriel is knowingly his ally. Lord Belzegar says, "We have learned why Miriel was able to bewitch the sea. We have learned why Miriel was able to bewitch the sea. It would seem that she has a new ally of cunning powers, an ally who has already bruised Numenor once, and is now gathering strength to make us bleed." So there's chaos on the streets of Numenor as the faithful are arrested. You've got the guards like banging on doors, putting signs up. Very, very stressful situation. Eregion rushes to find her father and hides him from the guards, and then he flees to Miriel's side. Elendil pleads with Miriel to follow him into the west of Numenor, but she insists that she must remain in the capital while encouraging Elendil himself to flee. She says, "My place is here, you know it is." And then Elendil says, "Then where is mine, if not with you?" So in this moment, Miriel reveals Narsil to Elendil. And when I was at the finale screening, everyone in the theater started clapping. And I thought it was really sweet, but also really funny that what gets everyone really excited is just like a sword. And as I was watching with my kids, I was pointing it out to them. I was like, this sword is so important. So I guess I am one of those nerds as well. So Miriel gives him the sword, and she calls upon him to reclaim his lordship and fulfill his destiny. Eventually, he does take it, and he flees. And then later we see that Miriel has been brought before the king's court in chains. And that is really where we leave off with Numenor. However, we do still have a little bit of wrapping up to do in Pelargir. So in Pelargir, Isildur is preparing to return to Numenor as a small company led by Kemen has arrived to essentially recolonize Pelargir. Kemen is really surprised that Isildur is alive, and he definitely seems to be panicking internally when he does see him. So Isildur asks Theo if he would like to come to Numenor, and he refuses, saying that he prefers to be a low man. So my theories about Theo becoming the king of the dead are beginning to intensify. Estrid then comes in and confesses her love to Isildur, and they just start kissing. I'm still waiting on word from the showrunners whether or not this kiss is meant to be romantic, and I haven't seen any needles being passed, so I'm not sure. Isildur asks Estrid to return to Numenor with him, despite the fact that she has a man currently literally building her a home with his own two hands. I understand that Isildur is handsome and aqueducts are cool. I'm sure if you've been living in the filth of Middle-earth, you are very excited about the idea of indoor plumbing, but this seems like a pretty cruel thing to do to poor Hagen, who has apparently, according to her, been nothing but kind to Estrid. Isildur then reunites with Kemen, and he learns that things are altogether unwell in Numenor. Despite their previous agreement with the Queen, Pelargir will now become a fortress for Numenorian soldiers, and the people of Pelargir will be required to trade timber for supplies in order to survive. At this point, Isildur basically has to make a choice between staying in Middle-earth or returning to Numenor to sort of deal with whatever this situation has now become. So he is forced to leave Estrid behind in Middle-earth, and he returns to Numenor with Beric. Kemen says, My father is now king, and yours is wanted for treason. It might have been worse. If I had had it my way, the old fool would be dead. Then, worst of all, he says about Beric, shall I have them slaughter the horse? Then he says, disrespect me again, and you really will be lost to Middle-earth. So, Kemen is definitely not a fan favorite this season. However, the actor has been doing a phenomenal job. The fall of Eregion. So Gil-galad, Elrond, and Arondir, who is mysteriously unscathed after being stabbed with what looked like a mortal blow in the last episode. He's completely fine. I don't even see any injuries on him. These three are brought into the courtyard of the city where orcs are ravaging with free reign. They pull down the statue of Feanor, and I thought it was funny because they make Gil-galad and Elrond watch as the statue of Feanor is torn down, and it looks like it's supposed to be this horrible moment of look, we've torn down this special statue you have, but these guys hate Feanor. The only person who would have cared to see the statue of Feanor torn down is Celebrimbor, and he's already dead. He's the only person who thought Feanor was cool. Everyone else hates Feanor. Now the scrolls of Celebrimbor are being brought out into the center of the courtyard where the statue was, and Elrond loses his mind. He freaks out and he says, basically, just kill me instead, don't burn the scrolls. And while that might seem like an extreme response, I think this is pretty in line with Elrond's character. However, pleading with orcs is never a good idea. His request is unheeded and the scrolls are all lit on fire. Finally, as we wrap up this plotline, the Dwarven soldiers arrive and the tides turn in favor of the elves. In the forge, the death of Celebrimbor. In Celebrimbor's workshop, Annatar shoots arrows directly at Celebrimbor, at very close range, as he lies on the ground in his forge. Annatar caresses Celebrimbor's bloodied face, pleading with him to reveal the location of the 9 rings. He gently bends the arrows that pierce Celebrimbor's flesh, tormenting him. This scene is intimate and beautifully tragic. It's one of the most brilliant scenes of the series and also the most painful to watch, so they did an incredible job. Annatar begins by chastising him, saying, "Look what you have done to yourself," as the man is literally shooting him with arrows. Then Annatar begins to sort of taunt him, saying, "Have you ever seen orcs in the heat of combat? When Gondolin fell, they say it went on and on for weeks. Tell me where you have hidden the rings, and I will end your suffering now." Then he also says, "All I have done has been for you. Yours was the fire that crafted the marvels of the age. I only wished to share them with the world." So Sauron is continuing to be delusional. Celebrimbor responds, "But the rings are beyond your reach, as I shall be ere long. For soon I shall go to the shores of the morning, borne hence by a wind that you can never follow." Annatar continues to bend the arrows until he turns away and picks up a spear that had been lying on the ground. Annatar says, "There are ways of keeping you alive." And then he says in Sindarin, "Melon, must I show you my mastery of that craft as well?" Celebrimbor responds, "Craft? Your only craft is treachery. So pure it shall betray the very hand that forges it." This really hurts Annatar's feelings, to which he replies, "Your words are empty." In his final moments, Celebrimbor stands and lays a doom upon Sauron, saying, "Hear me, shadow of Morgoth. Hear the dying words of Celebrimbor. The rings of power shall destroy you, and in the end, I foresee, one alone shall prove your utter ruin." Annatar then turns in anger and impales Celebrimbor with the spear, sliding him up the pillar. In his final words, Celebrimbor calls him Sauron for the first time, the Lord of the Rings. A tear falls from Celebrimbor's eye, and he bows his head and dies. In this moment, Annatar also begins to cry as well. In an interview with Nerdist, actor Charlie Vickers recalls that moment was unscripted. The interviewer asked him, "Why does Sauron cry at Celebrimbor's death?" And Charlie Vickers responded, "I don't know, it just happened. And that's the honest truth. As an actor, you just put yourself in the moment, and if something happens, it happens. It never happened to me before as Sauron, and I didn't want to block that. If they use it, they use it, and they did use it. So then Glug leads a small company of orcs into the forge room as Annatar stands looking up at Celebrimbor crying. Glug asks him if he is Sauron, to which he responds, I have had many names. What is yours, Uruk? The death of Adar. After leading several refugees safely out of the city, Galadriel allows herself to be captured by Adar's orcs to ensure the refugees' safety. She is then brought before Adar, where he kneels before a large rock, upon which is placed Morgoth's crown. Adar turns to Galadriel, and it is seen then that he wears Nenya, which has healed him from an age of torment. He then tells Galadriel that his given name was not Adar, but he will not reveal it because Adar, which means father, is the name that he earned. He returns Nenya to Galadriel, asking her to use it to vanquish Sauron for the sake of his children. He pleads for peace, vowing to recall his children to Mordor, never to make war on Middle-earth again. Galadriel places Nenya back on her finger as the scars of torment across Adar's body begin to reappear. Galadriel says, I have slain more of your children than any elf alive. And Adar responds, I forgive you. No more flames and no more darkness. Let this ring heal the rift between elf and Uruk. Let us create a lasting peace in Middle-earth, now and forever. Glug is then carried by several orcs on a gurney towards Adar. The orcs claim that he was wounded by Sauron. Adar asks Glug for his forgiveness, but Glug responds that it is too late. The orcs then betray Adar, stabbing him in the same manner in which they did to Sauron so long ago. Adar does not defend himself or struggle against the attack, but calls out to his children as he lay dying. Sauron then takes command of the orcs, commanding them to raise Eregion and to bring the elvish leaders to him. In his final words, Adar says, My children, and Annatar replies, They are not children anymore. Sauron and Galadriel's confrontation. As Galadriel watches the orcs in horror, Annatar appears, picking up Morgoth's crown. Galadriel says, All this was your design from the beginning. Sauron replies, Please, you think too much of me. The road goes ever winding. Not even I can see all its paths. Sauron kneels before Adar's body with his back turned to Galadriel. She picks up her sword to attack him, but he turns and stops the sword using the crown. He is entranced by the beauty of Nenya, remarking, It is even more beautiful than Celebrimbor led me to believe. Give it to me. Give me your ring and the 9. At the beginning of their fight, he is acting defensively and fighting very calmly, but as the scene progresses, he becomes more aggressive and offensive. Sauron says, It is not my wish to harm you. Galadriel responds, Do you wish to heal me? Sauron says, I wish to heal all Middle-earth. And Galadriel responds, As you have Eregion? Sauron then says, Galadriel, surely you of all elves must understand that to find the light, we must first touch the darkness. And then Galadriel responds, We are not alike. We never were. It was just another of your illusions. And then Sauron goes, Not all of it. Galadriel then kicks Sauron, which somehow sends him flying off a ledge and rolling down a hill. And when she sees him next, he appears as Halbrand. He stands before her, regaining his control over the situation as she is stunned by the appearance of the man for whom she, quote, felt it too. Halbrand recalls one of their moments from season 1, saying, Fighting at your side, if I could just hold on to that feeling. He then appears as Galadriel herself, who again recounts one of their season 1 moments, saying, They could no longer distinguish me from the evil I was fighting. Galadriel then fights against herself, which I felt was very symbolic as she was, and still might be, wrestling with her feelings towards Halbrand and or the temptation of his power. Sauron then appears as Celebrimbor, saying, Are these not the seeds you planted? This recalls Galadriel's vision in episode 2 of season 2, suggesting that it was either Sauron himself that planted this vision in her mind, or that he is at least able to perceive her mind in some way. Sauron then returns to his Anatar guise as she crawls across the ground, and he kicks her sword out of her reach. He says, "I see you. I know your mind. The door is still open." And then Galadriel says, "The door is shut," and roundhouse kicks him straight in the face. After Galadriel's declaration that the door is shut, Sauron becomes pretty mad. He seems enraged. Their fight intensifies, and it ends when he stabs her right in the collarbone area with Morgoth's crown. He then uses the crown to drag her across the stone archway before pulling it back out. When she falls to the ground, the rings fall from her shirt and Sauron claims them. Sauron says, "I would have placed a crown upon your head. I would have never rested until all Middle-earth had been brought to its knees to worship the light of its queen." Galadriel responds by saying, "The free peoples of Middle-earth will always resist you." Now speaking directly into her mind, Sauron commands Galadriel to give him her ring. She holds out Nenya to him, appearing to surrender. However, she then says, "You wish to heal Middle-earth? Heal yourself," before stepping backwards off the cliff. Sauron reaches for her hand, which holds Nenya, but she is now beyond his grasp. As she falls, Sauron watches from above. There's an interesting camera technique that's been used to show Galadriel as she lays in the woods after her fall, and I can't help but wonder if this is meant to be Sauron's view of her from above. The way that it is framed is almost like an eye watching her. Back at the top of the cliff, Sauron kills Glug in anger, which horrifies the remaining orcs and really solidifies my opinion that they definitely shouldn't have betrayed Adar. His whole death is very heartbreaking. The last time that we see Sauron in this season, he is holding Feanor's hammer as he continues to look down from atop the cliff. Will he use the hammer to forge the One Ring later on? The fall of Galadriel and the foundation of Imladris. As Galadriel falls, the elves see her from afar and rush to find her, where she lies mortally wounded. If physics or gravity or normal consequences existed in this show, she would be dead many times over, but she's not. Gil-galad uses his ring to heal Galadriel, but it is not powerful enough alone, so Elrond picks up Nenya, and with it he heals Galadriel. In this moment, Gil-galad says, her very immortal spirit is being drawn into the Shadow Realm. I can't help but wonder what was Sauron's intention in stabbing Galadriel. I don't think it was meant to kill her. Gil-galad examines her wound and remarks that her spirit is being drawn into the Shadow Realm. Would she have become a wraith? Was Sauron's intent to ensnare her in this way? Elrond then leads the survivors of Eregion to this new valley, which will almost certainly become Imladris or Rivendell. Later, after some unspecified amount of time, Galadriel awakens and is met by her elven fellowship. Together, the elves must decide whether to retreat and fortify their defenses, or to pursue Sauron immediately. Galadriel says, "I would remember the counsel of our dear friend Celebrimbor, greatest of elven smiths, and remind our people that it is not strength that overcomes darkness, but the light, and the sun yet shines." So despite this crushing defeat, the season ends on a very hopeful note. So reflecting on the season finale, let's begin with the highlights. I've said it a few times, but the Dwarven storyline is just completely perfect. The opening sequence between father and son, ending with the king's sacrificial death, was just completely breathtaking. I've cried every single time I've watched it. The dialogue between Durin IV and his father, recalling the times when they would arm wrestle, culminating in his father's parting words, were completely brilliant and devastating, and Bear McCreary's musical score in that scene added to the emotional depth as well. When he says, "I never let you lift your hand. It was you. Just you, getting stronger. Forgive me, my son, King Durin." That just absolutely killed me. The final scene between Sauron and Celebrimbor held the most painful and yet perfectly Tolkienian moments of the finale, which was to be expected as their story had been one of the season's greatest strengths. Charlie Vickers and Charles Edwards are such a gift to this series, and I know that Celebrimbor will be dearly missed. The final highlight of this episode for me was the culmination of Adar's storyline. Adar had been my most anticipated character from the moment he was announced, and I've loved him in both seasons, as he was played in Season 1 by Joseph Mawle and then taken into Season 2 with Sam Hazeldine. The way that this character was used to explore some very complex questions that Tolkien himself wrestled with in terms of the orcs was very thoughtfully done and added so much depth to the story. Despite being an original character, Adar felt more Tolkienian than many other aspects of the series. Now, his death is something that I felt was inevitable, but even knowing it was coming was still not enough to prepare me for how sad I've been about it. I feel his redemption was so beautiful and there was so much potential there, yet it was really cut short unnecessarily. Even 15 more minutes with Adar would have meant the world. Instead, we're left with so many questions. His death reminded me of Gollum, actually, the person most harmed by Sauron, who endured the longest of his torment, has come so close to this repentance that is ultimately cut short. There's a hopeful or redemptive ending, more or less, for everyone else but him. And the difference is that with Gollum, Tolkien was using this ending to emphasize the role of fate or providence or Eru at work, whereas I don't feel the showrunners were doing much else other than trying to tell their story in another ring. They love patterns. So Season 1 starts with a assassination, so let's end it with an assassination. Is that really all that it comes out to? Sometimes I feel like they treat their story so flippantly and they just toss around whatever ideas without considering the consequences, and I think this is one thing that majorly sets this show apart from the Tolkien that they're trying to imitate. It's hard to imagine moving forward into Season 3 without Celebrimbor or Adar. At times I've begun to wonder if I will even enjoy the series at all without them, so I do hope whatever the showrunners are planning will be compelling enough to draw me back in. The finale really did come with some devastating losses, and I feel like a lot of the fan community is grieving right now. Now, I don't think this is necessarily a criticism, but rather a personal preference or reflection, but the last 15 minutes of the finale were some of my least favorite moments of the season. If I were in charge of editing, I might have wrapped up the more minor plot lines or the weaker storylines earlier on so that we could end on a stronger note. Going from Celebrimbor's death to Pelargir was a bit jarring, and then having to sit through the Grand Elf moments were not my favorite. Once again, I think this comes down to me personally being a very big fan of the elves and not caring very much about anything else, so I think this is just my elf bias shining through, but every time I've watched the finale episode, and I've probably watched it at least 6 times by now, I've just felt very at the end. It's just such a mixed bag for me. I do, however, have a few critical concerns. Maybe these are real criticisms. The biggest disappointment from the finale was the way in which Celebrimbor's death was handled. I had been expecting the banner to be positioned in place of the Feanor statue for the remaining elves to see. This would have properly struck fear and horror into their hearts and really driven home the devastating defeat that they're experiencing. I also think it would have meant a lot for Celebrimbor to see the Feanor statue being torn down, because, as I've mentioned before, Gil-galad and Elrond are not fans of Feanor anyways, so why would they care that the statue is being torn down? For neither Elrond nor Galadriel to actually see Celebrimbor's body removes the emotional impact for both of the characters and the audience, which just deeply disappointed me. Tolkien describes Celebrimbor's death in Unfinished Tales, though the series does not have the rights to this source material. Tolkien writes, "Concerning the 3 rings, Sauron could learn nothing from Celebrimbor, and he had him put to death. But he guessed the truth, that the 3 had been committed to elvish guardians, and that must mean to Galadriel and Gil-galad. In black anger he turned back to battle, and bearing as a banner Celebrimbor's body hung upon a pole, shot through with orc arrows. He turned upon the forces of Elrond." So that is kind of what I was expecting, and once again, I know they don't have the rights to that, but I was expecting his death to at least have a little bit more of an impact on the other elves around. The reunion between Sauron and Galadriel was so heavily marketed that the scene itself felt a little bit disappointing. I do feel like those who are big fans of Galadriel were probably a bit misled by the direction taken by the marketing, who seemed to promise more than they were able to actually deliver. We know from interviews that the connection between these two characters will endure through the series itself, but I didn't necessarily see much of that on screen. I think 4 or 5 more little moments placed throughout the season could have allowed for their ultimate reunion to carry more of an emotional impact. And some of the dialogue was really compelling. When he says, "I would have placed a crown upon your head," amazing. While others, such as "heal yourself," and "the free peoples of Middle-earth will always resist you," those made me cringe a little bit. In fact, I think this is actually a pretty big issue I feel the series has as a whole. So much of the story is explained via interview instead of shown on screen. Particularly in season 2, it almost felt like entire episodes worth of storytelling were missing. The majority of fans do not have the time or the desire to dig through every single interview or marketing piece in order to fully grasp the story. They want to sit down, enjoy the episode, and then move on with their lives. And I personally don't feel that's possible with the Rings of Power. Almost everyone I talk to has questions, and they are questions that should have been answered on screen. The dialogue is also just such a mixed bag sometimes. There are some really profound moments that have me on the verge of tears or like actually bawling my eyes out. But then there are moments that had me rolling my eyes harder than I previously thought possible. I don't understand how this continues to happen. I think it's probably one of the biggest weaknesses of the series. I also feel similarly about the moments of brilliant storytelling juxtaposed with moments of, the hobbits being twee and calling the stranger Grand Elf, for example. At times, I feel like I'm getting whiplash from the emotional roller coaster of it all. Like, I'm sitting here thinking, this is the greatest show I've ever seen. And then, we cut to another scene and I'm like, I don't even recognize this. As we move towards season 3, I hope that the production will be able to smooth out these inconsistencies. However, at the end of the day, The Rings of Power is still miles ahead of any other television series I've watched in recent years. Visually and musically, this series is perfect. Like, as I've said before, Bear McCreary just gets a 10 out of 10. Everything he does is perfect. The storytelling explores some of the most important themes in Tolkien's works and depicts some of Tolkien's characters with surprisingly keen insight. I treasure the fact that this series is free from the kinds of abuse and degradation of women that has become incredibly common in fantasy television. I personally am very sensitive to graphic violence, and I feel like the violence depicted in this series is done really tastefully and always in support of the storytelling, rather than violence for shock value. Overall, to be able to journey back into Middle-earth and to do so with my whole family, while fast-forwarding some of the more intense parts with the kids, is such a gift. Now, this is not the story I'd have written, and it's not necessarily the story that Tolkien wrote either, but I wouldn't trade it for the world, and I look forward to seeing whatever the showrunners are planning for season 3. I'm also planning to do a full season review similar to the one I did for season 1, but that's going to come later. I would like to do another rewatch of the season and get a few more hours of sleep since my baby is only 2 weeks old. I have really enjoyed talking through this season with all of you. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the episode, so please do leave a comment if you'd like. And if you'd like to connect on social media, you can find me at Tea with Tolkien.